Gildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to participate in this historic debate. And I just want to start off by congratulating the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister and, in fact, the former leader of the official opposition, who has made a significant contribution to seeing that this agreement gets to the place it is now. Indeed, all colleagues, particularly colleagues who are part of the Canada-US Parliamentary Group, led by the honourable member from Malpeque. Indeed, all of us were down to Congress many times in many senators and congressmen's offices, extolling the virtues of an agreement. It really was a Team Canada approach, and I think all members should see themselves in this agreement as we debate it, and ultimately, I hope, ratify it. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to take a slightly different approach to this agreement and talk about its security benefits. So it's trite but true, Mr. Speaker, but countries that trade together don't very often go against each other in war or any other form of conflict. And so, if I may, I'd like to take these few moments to talk about the security element that is generated by virtue of this agreement and other agreements. We in Canada are extremely fortunate. Possibly our public and even members in this House don't realize how fortunate we are to have a European trade agreement, we have a Pacific trade agreement, and we are about to have a North American trade agreement. That, Mr. Speaker, is 1.4 billion customers with which we have access to those markets. 41 countries. And I dare say, Mr. Speaker, there is no other country in the world that can claim such privileged access to such a large pool of customers. And of course, Mr. Speaker, it is up to us to take advantage of this agreement, not only the North American agreement, but the European and the Pacific agreement as well. But 1.4 billion customers, Mr. Speaker, and we should not only look at these citizens, these customers as trading partners, but we should also look at them as allies. Mr. Speaker, that gives us, without going into business about NATO or anywhere else, 41 new allies. And those allies provide us with a level of security that we have not enjoyed for a long time. I contrast that, Mr. Speaker, with, say, Russia. Who can Russia say is an ally? Maybe Belarus, Kazakhstan, Syria, Iran, maybe not the A-list of allies that one would want, or China. Who can actually say that who is the ally of China? Possibly North Korea. North Korea may not be the most reliable ally that China's ever had, but contrast that with these three agreements taken collectively, where we put together, in effect, not only 41 trading partners, but 41 allies. And that is all to our collective security. So the collateral benefit of this trade agreement is clearly security. In fact, it is mutually reinforcing, Mr. Speaker, because security creates trade, trade creates security. These trading alliances are huge assets to Canada. Now, some would argue that trade comes first, security follows, and they'd point to the Auto Pact, they'd point to the first free trade agreement, then they point to NAFTA 1.0, and now the Canada-US-Mexico trade deal. But I'd like to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that actually security came before trade. And I'll go back 80 years, Mr. Speaker, and I know as soon as you say that, somebody starts to nod off because not a lot of people appreciate history, but I direct your attention, Mr. Speaker, to a meeting between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Mackenzie King in Ogdensburg, New York, where the two leaders negotiated a security arrangement for North America, known as the Permanent Joint Board of Defense. And from that agreement, the entire security architecture of Canada and North America was revamped. In 1941, Mr. Speaker, we were in the middle of World War I. In 1941, at the time the Prime Minister and the President were meeting with each other, was the Battle of Britain. And at that point, there was no guarantee, there was no assurance that actually Britain would emerge from the Battle of Britain as the victor. In that context, and at that time, there was enormous resistance by the American public, particularly led by the ambassador for Great Britain, Joe Kennedy, to engaging in any European conflict, yet another war. Yet President Roosevelt realized that North America was a vulnerable space. It was vulnerable on the Pacific side, and it was vulnerable on the Atlantic side. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was in a very delicate position because he realized that while we were going to continue to be allies of Great Britain and continue the fight, the shifting of empires was pretty obvious. We were going to be taking ourselves out from the security blanket of the British Empire and placing ourselves in the security blanket of the American or the emergent American empire. And that, Mr. Speaker, has been our security reality for the last 60, 70 years. Out of the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, a number of real decisions were made which continue to this day. Gander Airport, for instance, was developed as a military airport. It existed prior to the war, but it was really enhanced over the course of the war. That was a result of the Permanent Joint Board of Defense. The Alaska Highway was a result of the Americans' concern that the Japanese may come in through the west coast of Canada and separate Alaska from the continental United States. And there were quite a number of other institutions and military-to-military arrangements that were made, the most significant of which is NORAD. NORAD is clearly our most significant military treaty, and it was a direct result of the negotiations between Prime Minister Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt. Hence, Mr. Speaker, we created a security environment, and that security environment in turn led to the Auto Pact. That in turn led to the first free trade agreement with the United States. That in turn led to the first NAFTA. That in turn leads to where we are today. Because, Mr. Speaker, nations that have good security also have good trade. Those that have good trade generally have good security. So, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister Mulroney used to say that the job one of any Prime Minister is to manage the U.S. relationship. And there is great truth in that. And I want to just recognize that in very difficult circumstances, our Prime Minister has managed this relationship as well as it can be managed. Hence, we are here today with an agreement that many, many members of this House will be able to sign on with conscience. The other consequence of this agreement, Mr. Speaker, was that we've got preferred nation status with respect to military procurement. So in military procurement, we are treated as a domestic supplier. Similarly, we treat the Americans as domestic suppliers. And that has relevance to the peripheral debate about aluminum, aluminum and steel in particular. And that was what was so silly about the 232 tariffs. We are effectively making each other's cost of military security more expensive. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the difficulties with tariffs. So congratulations to the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister. However, in my judgment, Mr. Speaker, the next most important treaty to be renegotiated is the NORAD treaty, because, as I say, good security makes for good trade makes for good security. Thank you for your time and attention.